Hello and welcome to the fifth and last lecture of week 4 of the Open University's MOOC on genocide. Today we conclude our discussion on the murder of the Gypsies by Nazi Germany during World War II. We'll briefly talk about the extermination of hundreds of thousands of Gypsies in Eastern Europe, and then elaborate on the decision made by the Nazi leadership to eliminate nearly half of the Sinti, the German Gypsies, in 1943. As we know, World War II breaks out in 1939. We talked about it briefly this week in the previous lecture. The same year, shortly before the war starts, Germany and the Stalin-led Soviet Union sign the secret Ribbentrop-Molotov agreement, under which they commit to non-aggression and divide Poland between them. As you probably know, Hitler unilaterally breaches this agreement in 1941, when he secretly organizes and launches a huge military operation. Operation Barbarossa totally surprises the Soviet Empire and Red Army as vast parts of Eastern Europe are conquered rapidly. During the same period, from 1941 and on, millions of Jews fall into the hands of the Nazis. This eventually leads to the need for a so-called final solution, the extermination plan, in which about 6 million Jews died during World War II. However, the Jews aren't the only victims of these historic repercussions of Operation Barbarossa. As well as the Jews, the Gypsies, most of them live in Eastern European territories taken over by the Nazi army, the Wehrmacht, in 1941, suffer from the Nazi wrath in similar contexts. The minister in charge of the eastern sector, those vast territories conquered during Operation Barbarossa, was a Nazi called Alfred Rosenberg. Rosenberg was a founding member of the Nazi Party and one of Hitler's main supporters back in the early days of the Munich beer hall speeches and the failed 1924 putsch. Rosenberg is a pronounced racial ideologue, though to be honest, he wasn't such a great intellectual. Rosenberg hates and loathes Jews, an obvious and normal sentiment, especially among the Nazi leadership. But Rosenberg hates and loathes Gypsies too, which is not at all an obvious sentiment among the Nazi leadership. Because, as I said, Hitler didn't loathe Gypsies or even care about them. And as I'm about to say, the second most powerful person in the Nazi leadership, the supreme commander of the SS, the Reichsführer SS, the notorious Heinrich Himmler, actually liked Gypsies. Soon we'll elaborate on this. Either way, Alfred Rosenberg is appointed as the Nazi minister in charge of the occupied Eastern territories and targets not only Jews but Gypsies too. Under his direct orders, hundreds of thousands of Gypsies under Nazi occupation in Eastern Europe are slaughtered. Some of them are murdered by the Einsatzgruppen troops, those groups sent to the front lines to eliminate Jews, communist commissars and Gypsies. Some are sent to extermination camps. The total estimate of Eastern European Gypsies murdered by the Nazis in a premeditated, meticulous and systematic fashion is about 300,000 people. This is the accepted estimate among researchers, although some Gypsy organizations may claim higher numbers. But this is more or less the agreed number by researchers of this period. The Gypsies of Eastern Europe, the Nazis called by the generic name Roma, assuming they are mixed, Mischlinge, and thus worthy of slaughter and extinction, should be distinguished from the Sinti, the German Gypsies. As you know, many in the German leadership believe that at least some of the Sinti are Indo-European, that is, real Aryans. There is a fierce debate about what should be done with them. The mere fact, as I told you in the last lecture, that all draft-eligible Sinti men are enlisted to the Wehrmacht is very telling. We can rule with certainty that until 1942 there is no attempt to exterminate the Sinti, while we do see systematic extermination of Gypsies in Eastern Europe. In 1943, the situation is turned upside down. The order is given to discharge all Sinti men from the German army. They are all sent to Auschwitz and joined by the families who were left behind in Germany. The main question is, why does this happen? What changes exactly? How is it that the Sinti, who until 1943 were protected from any final solution, suddenly find themselves, at least many of them, in the same situation as the Jews and other racial groups condemned to death by the Nazis? The explanation is not at all elegant, nor methodical. Basically, I stress the unfortunate fact that the decision to exterminate the Sinti isn't preceded by a profound thought process. There are no plans or policies that show it taking form in advance. Ultimately, although it's sad to say this, the extermination of the Sinti was done almost casually. In other words, unless Auschwitz, Treblinka, and other extermination camps were built primarily for the Jews, it's very likely that the extermination of the Gypsies wouldn't have been proposed. I'm talking about the extermination of the Sinti, the German Gypsies, of course. The man considered the great patron of the Sinti in Germany was the abhorred Heinrich Himmler, I just mentioned, the notorious supreme commander of the SS, who in 1941 becomes the most powerful man in Germany after Adolf Hitler. The organization he leads, the SS, supersedes the German army to a certain extent, holding major positions of power. Some of you may not know that Heinrich Himmler wasn't as ignorant as his Führer Adolf Hitler. Hitler was self-taught in many ways and studied art, as we know. Unfortunately, his teachers at the Art Academy in Vienna didn't think he was good enough, so he pursued a different career than he had hoped for when he was young, which is too bad. However, he didn't have a formal education. Heinrich Himmler was much more educated than Hitler. He was also a real romantic and mystic. For example, he was the driving force behind the establishment of the peculiar and odd Organization for Heritage Research, or in German, Nuremberg, established in Nazi Germany in the 1930s before World War II broke out. Its goal was to find, identify, and excavate all kinds of ancient Aryan artifacts from various places around the world. This is reported in books and studies, and the story is fascinating, suggesting the elusive, romantic and mystic character of mass murderer Himmler. Himmler is aware of the Aryan myth, even with respect to the Gypsies. He is aware of and appreciates the fact that they belong to the Aryan race. At a certain point in the war, after the 1941 Operation Barbarossa, which cost much more than expected, Himmler proposed to clean a territory in Eastern Europe and turn it into a kind of safari for the Sinti, who could migrate there and maintain the traditional lifestyle. Himmler sees the Sinti as a living example of the lifestyle of their common Aryan ancestors in a positive, romantic way. I know this sounds weird, but that's the best description I can give for this very strange situation. As the war advances and the months go by, the great victory of Operation Barbarossa is replaced with a totally different situation. In 1943, it's quite clear that the Nazis failed to subdue the Red Army. The Red Army, which suffered unthinkably heavy losses of millions of soldiers, regroups, and by 1943, as most researchers of the period agree, the Nazi leadership realizes the war is already over. The question now is whether it would end with a big or little Germany. What price would the Nazis have to pay for their future defeat by the Soviet Red Army? This is the main reason why Himmler loses interest in the Gypsy question. He simply has no time to deal with the fate of 40,000 Sinti compared to the lives of tens of millions of people which are on the line in 1943. Rosenberg, the minister in charge of the Eastern sector, who is obsessed with his hatred of Gypsies, eventually applies pressure along with others who share his view, and it is then decided to solve the problem of the Sinti in Germany as well. As stated, the Sinti soldiers are subsequently released from the army, sent to Auschwitz, and reunited with their families. Although it's ultimately meaningless, it's worth noting that in Auschwitz, the Sinti Gypsies enjoy better conditions, if we can even call them that, compared to the camp's Slavic or Jewish prisoners. They have a separate camp and the families are allowed to reunite. Consider it as something slightly different from the beastly and ghastly way the Nazis treated the Jews, where men and women were separated and kids were taken away from their parents, as if they were lambs sent to slaughter. The Gypsies are allowed to live together, have relations, etc. for some time. They also receive better nutrition and slightly better treatment from the guards. There are truly strange stories about guards who don't know what to do with decorated gypsy soldiers coming from battle. The guards in Auschwitz simply don't know how to treat these decorated ex-soldiers. Bottom line, it is ultimately decided to cleanse the gypsy camp in Auschwitz, if I can use the same whitewashed Nazi term, and terminate it. There are testimonies of Jewish prisoners in Auschwitz who personally witnessed the day when all the gypsies were ordered to march towards the crematoriums and then exterminated. We estimate that nearly 15,000 Sinti German gypsies were exterminated in Auschwitz. Some of them weren't touched since they were considered pure blood. Some of them were luckily only castrated back in the 1930s and not condemned to actual physical annihilation. At the end of World War II, when Nazi Germany is defeated, as we all know, the United States and the Soviet Union emerge as the two superpowers and decide how to punish Germany and divide it into two states, West Germany and East Germany. West Germany takes responsibility for the Nazi crimes almost immediately, albeit it takes a few years, and meanwhile the Nuremberg Trials take place, but eventually, as we well know, West Germany repents for the Nazi sins, makes a reparations deal with the Jews, both the State of Israel and private individuals, thus restoring their status among the so-called family of enlightened nations rather quickly. However, it takes the Germans 40 years to recognize the crimes committed by Nazi Germany against the Gypsies. Only in 1985 does the then German president publicly declare that Germany committed crimes against humanity towards the Gypsies and expresses his apology. From that moment on, any Roma or Sinti Gypsy who could prove they were sent to Auschwitz or other camps, or castrated or sent to forced labor, just like Jewish or Slavic Holocaust survivors, the two groups targeted by the Nazis, any Gypsy who meets the description can get compensated and recognized as a victim of Nazi crimes. Recently, in 2013 in Berlin, a very interesting monument was unveiled in the capital of unified Germany. It was designed and built by the terrific Israeli sculptor Dani Caravan. This monument is in a very central location, right in front of the Reichstag building in a very nice part across the street from the German parliament. Although it's not in the same scale of monuments commemorating the Jewish Holocaust, it is still another symbol of the repentance for the Nazi crimes against the Gypsies, even though these things take time to happen. However, even today, frequent polls asking the German population what they think about various ethnic groups and religions, like who they'd like to work with, who they'd like the children to marry, which group is scary and which is worth emulating, and these are recognized surveys held all over the world, the Gypsies still get very low scores and are categorized as criminal, scary, and culturally low group. Nobody is very happy about their presence. Today there is a federation of Sinti and Roma organizations in Germany. They have a very interesting website where you can find a lot of information. However, the Gypsies outside Germany don't have funding or lobbyists in the governments of various European states. It seems that to this day, the Gypsies are a notorious minority group in Europe, which the authorities, be it in France, Hungary, anywhere, can harass, expel, or treat as they please. Most of the European population considers the Gypsies a contemptible group that doesn't belong there and should go away. We now end our discussion on the murder of the Gypsies by Nazi Germany during World War II. I hope this series of 5 lectures was interesting and that you learned new information. Next week we'll meet again for our last week of the MOOC on genocide to discuss incidents of genocide on an inconceivable scale in North and South America, the original Native American populations who lived there before the white men arrived. It's a fascinating and moving story, and I hope you find it as interesting as the issues we focused on in the first 4 weeks of our course. Thank you for now, and goodbye.